A major component of price indices with a major measurement problem, measuring consumption, causes confusion. Looking forward to this one today. We're going to talk about shelter inflation. Shelter has proven to be a very sticky component of inflation, and there's a great deal of criticism of the government statistical agencies responsible for this measurement for their methods of measuring shelter inflation, specifically something called OER, owner's equivalent rent, which is the largest component within shelter, which is part of the Consumer Price Index and PCE for that matter. In this video, we'll briefly explain the different upper level index measures of inflation. Then we'll drill down on how shelter inflation is measured. We'll explain how the CE survey affects both rents and OER components of shelter, and how the CE survey includes arguably the most well known survey question, the OER question, which confuses and outrages most who don't fully understand how it's used. We'll explain how survey questions are used and maybe more importantly, how they're not used to measure shelter inflation. My name is Aaron Montell, macro to mortgage, joined by Jenny Montell, an economist who has dealt with government data like this for many years.
Excited to be here with you talking about this often confused and important topic.
So, just a real quick recap, headline versus core versus super core. So, when we talk about headline inflation, we're talking about all categories of goods and services. And you'll often hear core referred to separately. Core inflation excludes the price of food and energy because those items can be quite volatile for a number of different reasons, from geopolitics to weather to many things. And by removing food and energy, we remove the quote unquote noise associated with the volatility of these things. And then there's something called super core, which has only recently become a thing within the last few years. And that is services X shelter, which is said to portray an even clearer picture of the underlying trend, which really is what we're trying to get at, the underlying trend. And we did a video not too long ago that really was a deep dive into CPI, PCE, and PPI. If you want to go back and review that video, you can find it on our Substack or our YouTube channel. It's called Inflation, How It's Measured, appropriately enough.
Yep, and a couple of reasons to exclude shelter. It's not that that one is volatile. It's more so that some components of shelter, specifically OER that you mentioned, is very hard to measure, and it is also both the rent and the OER component are lagged a bit. So that's one reason, or a couple of reasons that folks look at supercore inflation. Another index that excludes just OER is known as the Harmonized Index of Consumer Prices, or HICP. And this is really popular in Europe. They tend to look at this, and the Bureau of Labor Statistics publishes an HICP index as well, in line with the European definition, so that they can be compared. And it has two principal differences from the CPI. One, it includes rural population in its scope. And if you watch our video that Aaron just mentioned from previously, it'll talk about how the CPI excludes the rural population. But importantly, it excludes owner occupied housing, or that owner's equivalent rent. And like I said, basically because it's hard to measure and measurements of it are lagged. And we're going to get into all of that in more detail here in the next few slides. But first, Aaron's going to talk about a couple of graphs that show the lagged nature of the housing data.
Yeah, it's interesting. I pulled these graphs directly from the St. Louis Fed, so you can go and replicate them if you'd like. But it's just interesting to visually see the lag of shelter. Here in this first chart, we're looking at headline CPI against shelter. So we pulled shelter out and charted it against headline CPI, and you can see that it in fact it lags, and it's visually obvious. It lags in both directions. So headline CPI is quicker to move up and quicker to move lower over time. Just like you mentioned, Jenny, shelter is is it's hard to measure, and it's a lagged measurement, and that's just visually obvious here. And in the next chart, it's even more obvious because we add in what you just described, that harmonized measure. And that harmonized measure, you can see moves even quicker, up and down, having shelter removed.
Yeah, so in this one, you're comparing it to CPI and PCE with housing included. So
Right.
CPI and PCE are the red and green ones, the blue one being harmonized. So the main difference, it does include rural population, prices in rural areas, but also includes housing, or excuse me, excludes housing, and therefore moves a little bit quicker on price changes,
That's right.
reflects price changes more quickly.
Yeah, that's basically right.
All right, well, then let's dive a little deeper into measuring the cost of shelter. So, the CPI and PCE, and again, our previous video really delves deep into the differences between those two. So, we won't delve into that now, but they're both based on the same set of data for the price part of it. And they weight things differently, and we'll talk about that later. But just in terms of the prices, they use the same data. And shelter has four components. There's rent, so renting of primary residence. And for renters, the cost of shelter is just the price of rent. And it typically includes utilities and some other things, but BLS makes adjustments to make those apples to apples, and we'll talk about that later. And then there's homeowners. And so this is what we're really focusing on a lot today is how do you get a price for that? And so the BLS has come up with something called the owner's equivalent rent of primary residence, or OER. And so for homeowners, the cost of shelter is implicit. It's unobserved because they don't pay a rent value, but it's an estimated implicit rent value that they would have to pay if they were renting their home. Then those are the two biggest components. And so we're going to focus on those, but we should just mention the two other components, which is lodging away from home and renters and homeowners insurance. Those are included.
I'll just add real quickly. I'll add, the goal here is to make everyone a renter, right? That's the idea of this survey, is to make everyone a renter because it's about measuring the cost of consumption.
Yep. And very good point, Aaron. And we should also point out that we're not trying to measure the value of the house
Right.
because that is a capital good. It's not a consumption good. So that's why we don't just use home prices or something like that.
Right.
Okay, so measuring the cost of shelter involves data from 3 surveys. And each of these surveys, data from each of these surveys is used for a different reason, a different part of the ultimate measure. And so I have each of those reasons here underlined, so to keep it clear. And this is where a lot of confusion happens. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics has a survey that is actually conducted by the Census Bureau on behalf of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and it's called the Housing Survey. And they do it monthly, and it collects price observations of all kinds of goods and services. But for housing, price observations of rental housing units in urban areas. Again, it's used for both CPI and PCE. And it's used to compute the inflation rate for owner-occupied and rental housing. So this is where the price data come from. The price data don't come from that tricky question that Aaron mentioned, and we're going to talk about more. The prices themselves come from this housing survey, which is based on actual observed rental values. We'll get into that. It also uses the cost of shelter, also makes use of the Bureau of Labor Statistics CE survey that Aaron mentioned, which is the Consumer Expenditure Survey that happens annually, so it's less frequent. This is the one that has the tricky question in it, and it asks households for the share of their budget that goes towards all the different categories of goods and services. And it is used by the CPI to create weights for the calculation of upper level indices. So things like Aaron mentioned, like headline inflation, where it's a summary of inflation. It's a summary of the inflation across all goods and services. Well, goods and services make up different proportions of our household budget. And so those that make up bigger proportions need to be weighted more. So that's what we're talking about by weighting, when the weights are used just to calculate those upper level indices. And PCE uses different data for weights, but CPI uses data from this survey that has that controversial question we'll get to. But the main point here is that it's just used for the weighting part. Then there's the Census Bureau's American Community Survey, which is annual, and it has the number of rental units, number of owned units, and annual average rents by census tract. And so what these data are used to extrapolate the data from the housing survey sample to the whole population.
And so both those last 2 points I think are really critical to understand, and I know we're going to get more into them, but I really want to just underscore that the OER question in the CE survey is not used to determine the dollar amount which somebody would rent their house for. It's used to determine the weighting of that component of shelter within the survey. That's it, like full
Yep.
stop.
Yep.
And it's no coincidence that that number is in the low 40s, right? And it changes, right? Because that CE survey also asks respondents about their household income, so then they can determine the share of their household income that goes to rent. And it's no coincidence that as a mortgage originator, you're looking at debt to income numbers, and oftentimes the numbers you're looking at for a back end ratio are in the 40s.
Mhm.
That's no coincidence that both of those things are similar. And the census, the American Community Survey, basically rolls up everything and then extrapolates it back across an entire census tract.
Exactly, Aaron.
Okay.
Well said. Thank you. Okay, so just to reemphasize, because this is a really confusing point and,
Yeah.
and it's easy to be misled by this, the BLS does not use that consumer expenditure survey to compute the actual inflation rate for owner occupied housing. Instead, it uses data from the housing survey, like we just mentioned, which is based on real market data for rents paid for nearby properties with similar characteristics. Um, the CE survey does ask homeowners to estimate the rental value of their own homes, but again, only to determine how much weight to give owner occupied homes relative to other expenditure categories. So again, these weights only affect upper level inflation indices like headline, core, etc., not the actual housing price itself. Just when it's bundled up into a summary index of inflation is that used.
And they go through a series of formulas and calculations that adjust those rental prices that they capture in the housing survey. They basically have a formula which they can adjust based on square footage, bedrooms, bathrooms,
Oh
improvements,
yes,
etc.
exactly, 100%.
Yeah.
And we'll mention a few of those here
Okay.
next. So just a few more details on this housing survey where the actual price data come from. They're done in rolling samples. So they have 6 panels of sampled units, each surveyed every 6 months for 6 years. So they're surveyed twice a month. Most prices for most other goods are measured monthly, but for housing, it's just every 6 months. And that's because most rents in the sample are continuing rents. They're not new rents. And so the rent value, rent paid doesn't change very frequently. And so collecting the data less frequently also allows for a larger sample size. So that's great. Okay, now here's where we get into some of the adjustments that Aaron was talking about. So normalized rent adjusts for the age of the unit, changes in the type of heating or cooling equipment, changing in the number of pets and cars, etc., because that can change how much someone has to pay in terms of pet fees and parking spaces and stuff like that. So they get them all on the apples to apples basis. Okay, then there's something called economic rent, where cost estimates for utilities are added in if they're not included in the rent. And that's because most renters' rent includes utilities. So again, this is just getting it apples to apples. And then there are adjustments for any changes in other services included in the rent, like say your typical rent didn't change, but then you, or your rent went up, but it's because now the apartment complex has a swimming pool or you have off-street parking now, things like that. So they're trying to make everything, again, apples to apples. So they do a lot of work for this.
Mhm. So now that we've figured out how they basically make the data apples to apples, as you say, it's still possible that OER and rent can diverge and move in different directions from one another.
Yes, thank you, Aaron. And it's because we mentioned that based on their prices are based on the same data from the same housing survey, but their values can move distinctly from one another because there are certain rental units that aren't used in estimating OER. One example is rental units that are under rent control, because that would not be a good, it wouldn't be good to use that in estimating OER because homes aren't under rent control. There just isn't such a concept in home ownership. And then also, utilities are treated differently. So the estimated cost of all landlord provided utilities has to be subtracted from that normalized rent value to calculate what they call pure rent, which they use for estimating the OER index. And that's because homeowners pay utilities, kind of pay their own utilities as not part of quote unquote rent. Whereas when someone's renting a place, usually utilities are included in that rent number. And for homeowners, those utilities, the price of those utilities are accounted for in the household energy component of the CPI and the household utilities component of the PCE price index. So they're
Mm,
just included outside of shelter
okay.
for, yeah, for homeowners. And we talked about how that controversial question is used for weighting. So let's talk about that now. Here we're going to talk
Yes.
about that question. And also remember that the CPI and PCE use different data for their weighting. The CPI does use data from that consumer expenditure survey and uses these questions. For the OER component, the question is, if someone were to rent your home today, how much do you think it would rent for monthly, unfurnished, and without utilities? Now, one of the biggest arguments against this question or complaints about it is that it's probably hard for someone to really have a good sense for how much they could rent their home for. And while that might be true, a couple main points about this is one, remember this is just used for weighting. And so that's a much smaller, has a smaller effect. It's used for weighting when calculating those upper level indices like headline CPI. It's not really used for the actual OER price itself. It's for calculating those indexes. And the second thing is, as we mentioned in our last video, and we'll highlight here at the end of this one as well, is that we're looking at trends more so than the actual values. What's really important is the change in prices. And so if someone does misestimate how much their home would be rented for, as long as they misestimate it the same way every 6 months when they're asked this question, then the trend should still be a good trend. So that's something really important to point
Hmm.
out. And then the rent component, here's the question. Similar, except that they don't have to estimate it. They just have to be able to know what their rent is and answer honestly about what was their rent. And then, of course, what we were talking about, making sure things are apples to apples. They ask about extra charges for garage or parking facilities, and they make sure that they're not including any subsidies that they might receive from the government.
I just want to point out real quick because I think this is also another point that is sometimes misunderstood is this rent component. This is also a survey question, so this isn't hard data in the survey. It's
Mhm.
not pulling data directly from some database showing exactly what people pay. It's just people write that check every month, so they know what they pay, so they just fill out a survey question. But it's still soft data. Um, that is the source of the rent component here. And also, going back to the OER, we researched this, and it's not easy to find this information. I will say that, and we
Yep.
listened to several employees of the BLS speak about it, and they did say in regard to the OER, they said, yeah, some people just don't have an answer when they ask them that question about how much they can rent their home for, and in that case, the BLS has a process for which they estimate it for them. And in some of the talks we listened to, the gentleman speaking, he said that oftentimes the people that do respond, it's pretty good data. They're pretty right based on the estimation process that the BLS would use should somebody not have an answer for them. So I just wanted to make those 2 points quickly.
That's great to know. Yeah. And so sometimes when people really don't know, at least they're honest about not knowing, and then the BLS can use a different method instead. So
Yeah.
that's a fantastic addition, Aaron. Thank you. And then just to mention briefly that the PCE price index uses data from business surveys for its weights. So it doesn't use the consumer expenditure survey. And because of that, shelter makes up a much smaller component of PCE. So that's something to pay attention to if you're comparing CPI and PCE. And when you're looking at the headline inflation measures from both of those, they can differ, with CPI often being higher than PCE, but I think they are starting to converge recently a
Hmm.
little bit. But shelter makes up pretty much the largest component of both of them, but a much larger share of CPI, more than double that of PCE.
Yeah. Yeah. Good point. So there was a lot here today, and this information is hard to find. But here's some of the key takeaways. Is uh, as you mentioned, shelter the largest component of the consumer basket, and so it has the most weight in calculating these upper level inflation indexes. The cost of shelter is much slower to change since rents are often locked in for months or even years. And CPI and PCE use the same price data, the housing survey, but they apply different weights. And the BLS Consumer Expenditure Survey is only used for weighting the price data from the CPI housing survey. And again, the CE survey is the one that includes that OER question, only used for weighting. It isn't used to determine dollar values. And remember, the goal of OER is not to determine the dollar value. It's to track the delta, right? The difference, the change over time of the amount of a person's household budget that goes towards shelter. That's the whole idea. And so that, I think, is really the main takeaway here. Anything to add, Jenny?
Exactly how that amount is changing over time, and are those
Yeah.
prices rising relative to other things or not? So exactly.
Yeah. A lot of stuff here today. We thank everybody for watching. I assume there's some questions because this is one of those topics that always has a lot of questions, and please enter them in the chat below. We'll we'll do our best to respond. And if you like this content, please like and subscribe. And as always, thanks for watching.